Okay, let's see. It'll be fine. Excellent connection. Okay.
Good.
Hello, everybody. They should be able to hear us now. Fingers crossed. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all? Tell me if you can hear me. Yes, can hear Sophie. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, David. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Barry. Barry, it's not you. It's not you. Don't worry. Welcome, everybody, all to the Transport Tavern. I don't know what's happening with my lovely computer, but it seems to be dropping out a bit. Yes. Hello, everybody. Hello, Gordon, Roman Edocrat, and Gunnar. Well, good to see all the usual faces in. I am very happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Sophie Vohra. Dr. Sophie Vohra, who's just done her Viva, and she's now doctor, and it's wonderful, and congratulations to you. So, Sophie, please introduce yourselves to our patient masses.
Thank you, David. So as David said, I've recently just passed my Viva. I was doing my PhD at the University of York in collaboration with the National Railway Museum. And I've been looking at the commemoration of British railways over quite a large expanse of time. So that's what we'll be chatting about today. I thought about maybe focusing on one of the elements and then sort of going through it. I thought, well, actually, there's a lot we can talk about here, and hopefully kind of pique the interest of different members of the audience, virtual audience, as it were. So just glad to be here and hopefully spreading some new knowledge on railways, hopefully.
Oh, yes. I will say I've been reading Sophie's thesis, and it's absolutely excellent. I'm really enjoying it. So hopefully that will be out there in some form at some point.
Yes,
so eventually. So on the bar, Sophie. Oh, there's your picture in the bar. What are you drinking tonight?
Right, so I am originally from Cheshire, so I thought it might be a nice sort of ode to my family county and actually town. So this is Forest whiskey. There you are. And they're up in Macclesfield Forest. They do some wonderful stuff. I think they originally started with the gin that they've got, and they go and pick all the different things they need for it in the local area. And yeah, as soon as the whiskey came out, I was like, yeah, I'll absolutely get a bottle of that. But they do have a kind of tasting room, which is still open at the moment at certain points, despite the coronavirus. And yeah, so you can buy it online, but if you are in the area, it's absolutely well worth going and trying some of the stuff that they have actually in there. And just to be in Mac Forest, it's very lovely. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what I'm on this evening.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid I'm not on something as glamorous, but I'm on Dragonfly's Earl Grey Rubus, and I'm a big fan of it. So yes, so shall we continue on to our show? So celebrating and commemorating Britain's railways. So I'll move on to the first slide. Sophie, if you would, once I can move on, just introduce what's going on, what's here.
So one of the things that came with this PhD, so basically it's one that I applied for, and the remit was basically look at commemoration and railways. And it has to be one of the biggest topics I think I've ever encountered with so little written on it. And so some of the stuff that I'll be here to talk about this evening is just basically, this is everything I've done, but it is a sample of the types of ways that different communities and different sort of companies engage with railway history. So one of the first things that I started looking at was the Stockton and Darlington railway celebrations. The reason being more than anything that it was one of the it was the first railway that had all these kind of big scale commemorations stemming out of it. And they changed quite dramatically over time, I'd say, as you kind of move through the different people that were organising them. So focusing more on how the railway companies organised the celebrations for them. And then kind of shifting away from the technology, I wanted to be able to look at the way that heroes were, sort of engineering heroes as they were, have been celebrated and their reputation kind of carried through time. So I wanted to look at sort of a combination of George Stephenson, who held, quite a high renown for a very long time, versus Richard Trevithick, who the majority of the kind of commemorative things that were there to celebrate him just spent the time saying, he's forgotten, we need to remember him. George Stephenson's basically stole his thunder. And so how those sort of differ. And then sort of moving from these sort of outward big-facing commemorations into how railway workers and union members celebrated each other in their history. It's a very interesting one in terms of trying to find out how this was done. So company magazines is basically the route into that. And so looking at the ways that each of them kind of celebrated their staff and also the sort of history of their company. So GWR was a very good one for this because their history is the longest in terms of their name. And then it shifts quite dramatically into the sort of focusing on the 21st century. And or sort of later 20th century as well. So I looked at the way that, particularly being embedded in the museum for the PhD, looking at the way that the National Railway Museum and Locomotion in Shildon helped to celebrate railway history, both as a combination of how they're born out of commemoration, particularly with the National Railway Museum, for those of you that already know about sort of 1975 and the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and then also how they continue to support commemoration and sort of learning about railway history, both within the museum and in partnership with sort of companies now, for example, which leads quite nicely into thinking about how the recent rebrandings of both Great Western Railway and London Northeastern Railway have happened in the 21st century, and how much they pull on their history and how they use commemoration to kind of solidify these new identities. And then finally, this was a chapter I really enjoyed, which was looking at the plans for the Stockton and Darlington Railway Bicentenary in 2025. So this is well underway at the moment, and it's really, for me, it was really interesting because commemoration is used very differently now. And what I can hopefully just sort of spiel on about is a little bit how regeneration is a big part of what they're doing is kind of a central feature for the plans so far. Obviously, right now it's very tentative, but I think there's kind of you can gauge what it is that commemoration means and does now. So that's kind of a big thing. But basically, I think that commemoration is a really interesting way at looking at how people engage with history. And I said to David earlier, it's not necessarily about the truth of what happened. It's about what people want to be the truth and how they push this and how it works for them. So that's what I hope to talk about today.
Yeah. And I think that's something, as I was reading your thesis, is about that idea about how different people have deployed history for their own uses. And that's a very live question now, today, at the moment. So it's really interesting. You get a lot of resonance with some of the things that are being talked about how does history get purposed in different ways. So
absolutely.
Sorry,
go on.
No, okay, sorry. Okay, should we move on to the first slide?
Yes.
There we go.
So this is, I just wanted to give you some nice visual aids for for what I'm talking about here. But yeah, so I looked at the three different commemorative periods for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And as I said, with a particular focus on what the companies and obviously by 75 it's British Rail as the nationalised railways are doing to...
I'm really sorry.
No, you can't help it.
Virgin Media. Can everybody hear us?
You just blame 200.
Right.
Are we good?
I'm frozen. Yay. Go. Yay.
Okay, great. so yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember where I was kind of midway through talking, but yeah, so this was very much about, you know, sort of looking at the past, but more importantly, it was a way to kind of convey the success of these companies in the present and sort of signal towards how they might continue to progress into the future. And this was done quite heavily with technology. So the trains, the locomotives were a big vehicle, if you'll pardon the pun, for kind of pushing these narratives about where they were headed. In 1875, I'd say that maybe they hadn't quite got that down yet. It wasn't as well organized as the later celebrations, and it was very much, I think it sort of got a little bit muddled with the inclusion of the unveiling of a statue of Joseph Pease in Darlington. So you're kind of putting lots of things in there to try and figure out what it is that they're actually trying to celebrate, and a lot of that came out in the sort of criticisms of what they were doing. But one of the key things I'd say there is that their invited guests, a lot of them were of quite high political and economic importance, particularly to do with the railways, of course, a means of kind of showcasing what they're doing and where they're going. So by the time we get to 1925, there was far more organisation there, but one of the key things that was central to these was the International Railway Congress that was held in England that year. So they actually changed the year of the Congress to fit in with these celebrations. So originally it was going to be in Madrid in 1927, which is a bit of a shame, I guess, for Madrid, but and then changed them to 1925 in England to sort of bring those two things together, which actually says quite a lot, I guess, about the international recognition of the Stockton and Darlington Railway and British Railways more broadly. And so they were held across the country, down in London as well as up in the Northeast as well. Stockton had a sort of much bigger role in this, I guess, than they had previously. So in 1875, they were focused in Darlington, whereas they kind of branched out to Stockton. And would you mind just going to the next slide, David?
No
and then you might have to click it, make it do a thing. But one of the, I was going to say, is that the end? Hopefully not. But one of the big things that they had here was that they, particularly including Stockton here as well, and they were going through Yarm also, is that they had the moving vehicles, which they didn't have in the previous celebrations, which was a really good way to visually demonstrate how this progress was happening. And also, you know, you don't have to move from the spot that you are. You can see these trains coming past. But also this here is a cavalcade, one of my favourite things, where they basically go through the evolution of the wheel over time. So you start with a caveman there, trying to push something over some logs, then get the ancient Egyptians who are pulling a pharaoh on something. There's one gentleman there that's really happy to see that he's on camera. And then this is a great one. This is the 18th century, where they say that fashion discarded the wheel. So clearly there was no interest during this period for thinking about the kind of technological development. And then this is where it comes to the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and you have sort of Stevenson and all this kind of stuff sort of pushing it through and saying, you know, this is where we start again in the Northeast, and there's the model there. And then finally it shows the kind of worldwide use of railways, so how it's affected everywhere across the world, and all these different types of, I was going to say jobs, sort of professions, the collieries, the fisheries, all that kind of stuff. And I think it was a really nice way to kind of demonstrate, at least, you know, kind of looking back on it now, to see what it is that they thought that the railways had achieved and where they'd come from. And that was kind of a bigger one for this as well. They're kind of pushing back to these ancient paths. You know, it wasn't just 1825. We go so much further than that, and we're in this long history of transport. And so, yeah, that was a sort of really great element of this, which was then taken into 1975 as well. So obviously there was a lot that was done by sort of in the local area for different things for the celebrations, but I've focused more specifically on British Rail's reaction to this. And I think the best description of it was when Tim Strungelman said that during this period they were very nostophobic, really great word, which basically he describes as quite a deep disregard for the past. So it seems quite ironic that they'd spend so much time and energy celebrating the history of the railways. But then when you kind of unpick it further, they actually don't spend as much time talking about the past as you'd perhaps expect. There's, sort of an exhibition train that goes around the country, and only part of a carriage is actually talking about the past. The rest of it is about the APTE and all the things they're doing with Sea-Link, for example, and saying, this is where we're going in the future. And it really... it kind of pushed that so much further. It's this very subtle nod to the past. And I think there was one point in the minutes of some of the meetings where they say, we need to include the past to appease the enthusiasts, basically. And it's kind of less about that for them. And, this is a point where they're trying to sort of push steam out as well, trying to close that circuit and say, we've done steam now. This is where we're going. These electric trains, this is where we're headed. And here are all the other international things that we're doing. So if you kind of look at it in isolation from those celebrations, the kind of bigger ones that may have been happening were happening in the Northeast at the time by kind of local committees of organisers, BR is really not pushing as much as they have in the past on the history of the railways themselves. So yeah, it was really interesting.
I think what for me came out of that part of your thesis is the idea that steam as a motive power is depicted very differently in like 1925, and by it's almost completely flipped to being from being vanguard to old to old, whereas you've got these new technologies coming through.
Yeah, it is a very interesting kind of juxtaposition between the two different things. And I think that's it, isn't it? If you're kind of in the middle of a period where steam is, at its best, you've got kind of the point just, around kind of Scotsman and all that kind of stuff, and Gresley and his work. Of course, Flying Scotsman makes an appearance in the cavalcade as well. It's a very different point in history, and I think it's kind of trying to get into. There's more to be said than the fact that it is just a celebration, and by kind of delving into what these organisers wanted and what they wanted people to think about themselves, it becomes very targeted, and very much so.
I mean, the thing about the sort of tableau here that we're the cavalcade we're looking at is that they see very much their position at the end of a long process. And that sort of slides away, and I really just think that's fascinating. In up to 1975.
Yeah, so, it is. Yeah, sorry, on David, you go.
No, you go.
No, and I think that's right, and I think it is. It's almost like you wouldn't even position yourself anywhere, even in your most recent past in 75. It's just enough to say it happened, but look what's happening now. And as you said, the positioning of where they see themselves in time is very interesting. And I almost think that part of that is, as I said, with the kind of International Railway Congress, trying to weave in an international storyline more fervently in those than they have done in the other ones. It very much shows, I'd say. And then on the next slide, don't really just want to go to that one quickly as well. Here we go. So one of the things that I wanted to draw out of this as well is that, these were not uncontested narratives. It's one of those things where you think, if you looked at it at the face value, it's very much, this is how people thought about railways in their past. But I'd say I'd say that there are points in 1975 where the complaints were more about how much BR was spending versus, how much the local area was benefiting from these celebrations. Whereas in the earlier ones, it's very much, what is the narrative about and where do we fit in it? So this is from a cartoon by Chuck Richardson, one of my favourite cartoons and sources from this thesis, actually, where he's basically done a satirical cartoon of the celebrations, where he's kind of mocking everything that's happening and the kind of pomp and circumstance and what's happening. And one of the great things that they have because unfortunately you can't quite zoom in too much, but around the top you can see a kind of iron dragon figure, which is called the Northeastern system, and it's got words coming out of its mouth that say more, more, more. And sort of looking at it, and he references this also in a book that he did, which has prose to it, which is a little bit easier, therefore, to understand what he's talking about. The representation of Northeastern myth about the Lambton worm, which basically is a worm that comes out of a lake and then grows to a gigantic size by consuming most of Lambton. And just to compare that, just to say, basically the railway comes in and starts just sort of eating through all of the Northeast. It's not not that this is the image they were going to go for, but it's one of these things where it's like, you weren't going to talk about this. You weren't going to talk about the impact of what this has had on the local people, the local area, how people felt about it. And it was an opportunity to sort of say, this is what I think. This is maybe what others think. But it's just an opportunity to say, these are not narratives that people don't just let them lie. And as well as that, in 1925, there was the Railwaymen's Centenary, which was held in Manchester on the actual date of the anniversary. So that was held in September rather than July, which was the official celebrations. And it seemed very much about the sort of railway workers having the opportunity to say, this is where we fit in the narrative of railways and how we celebrate each other. And, they had similar things like, sort of cavalcades and stuff like that sort of looked at the history. And then this was the first time that they had the crowning of the Railway Queen as well. So I think it's very symbolic of sort of having that moment of saying, here is where we would fit. We're not as well represented in these big kind of company celebrations, but we are still here. So there's two different ways of just sort of saying these celebrations don't necessarily represent everything, or even the truth, I guess, in terms of this cartoon here.
I know we talked about it before we came on, but I mean, one of those things that I'm interested in unpacking is sort of the perception of things that are received. So I look at posters. I mean, what I found really interesting about this was the idea that, you can have something that we might say, so we've seen the cavalcade, it looks lovely and we interpret it through modern eyes. But actually at the time, when now it seems quite uncontested in the way we view it, at the time there are different interpretations always going on, and railway history is a space and a place where people impose, because it's a public service, maybe because, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the big things that I got out of this research as well is the fact that the railways touch so many communities and so many people in different ways. As you said, like from a passenger perspective, it could be from a worker's perspective, an enthusiast, a company. So actually trying to make some sort of generalization about how people felt about things is impossible, because different people will engage with this in different ways. And you're absolutely right. The perspective that you come at it depends on how you feel about the railways. You could feel negatively about them and be a passenger, or you could be, an enthusiast and enjoy one type of stuff and say, actually, that other stuff doesn't feel as great as this era of technology, for example. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's this whole idea of kind of multiple narratives that would be there, but through commemoration you basically only see one. That's the problem.
And I think something when I was reading about this commemoration is that issues such as safety as well came up, and of course safety is one of the big touchstone into issues of railway politics of the 1870s, so it's framed by that discourse and that debate at that time.
Yeah, very much so. Again, like you can't quite see it in the cartoon, but under that kind of plinth, there's some like drawings, which there's one that's like a diagram of the broken block system, I think, and it's just a pile of trains that have crashed, and it's great. Like, you know what I mean? Like these are the things where they're saying, you actually haven't talked about any of this, and they may not have even had discussions about this in terms, like if they're sat in the banquet hall eating, it's unlikely they would have sat there and said, "What's wrong with your railways? What do we change?" And but these are real things that are happening, and Mike's work, I guess, and Mike Asbesta, his work is looking at kind of accidents and stuff, and this is where it needs to be illuminated, really, that these may seem all kind of rosy and glowy, but there's so much more that's happening that is not this positive image that does get portrayed quite fervently, I guess. And it is because, you know, it's the companies that are talking about themselves and they're doing it on large scales. And you miss all these, as you said, these kind of these disasters, these things that happen because they just get missed out of the storyline, basically.
Yeah. Should we move on to the next?
Yes.
The statues.
Great, yeah. So I've kind of grown very fond of Richard Trevithick. I feel like he's my child a little bit because I just feel so sorry for him the whole time I was
we all get them for it. There is always somebody in a thesis that piques your interest, particularly more than others.
And I think that the more the point is, you know, everything that I feel about him is through the commemorative stuff, and I think that's quite odd, really, because it's not necessarily him; it's the way that he's talked about. So, as I said, like these are two very different engineers in terms of how their legacy has been carried on. It's not necessarily that you could say that George Stephenson had more of a direct impact on certain things in the industry, and Richard Trevithick is maybe a more not necessarily subtle, but subtle in the way that he's remembered in terms of how his inventions feed into what we know as the modern railway. So I started looking at this in terms of, you know, where do we start from in terms of the narratives about who they are and what they've done. And the big things that I found were the sort of opening biographies, I guess, that came out to sort of tell those stories about who they are and what they did. And for George Stephenson, I think one of the best things that could have happened to him was a gentleman called Samuel Smiles, who wrote both biographies about Stephenson, both George and Robert, and also a book called Self-Help, which is officially basically the first self-help book ever written. And in it, he used examples of men that were very exemplary, figures that could teach the ordinary man to be more extraordinary, I guess, or at least to feel like they're making an impact and doing something good. And Stephenson was like the figurehead of one of these because he, you know, young man, uneducated, poor family, and then went on to, you know, contribute to one of the greatest inventions in the world. That's the way that it's talked about. And from there, I think that really kind of pushed this image, or at least the narrative that people could work with then to say, you know, why is Stephenson so great? What is it that he's done and how do we talk about him? And then on the flip side of that, you have Richard Trevithick, and his biography was written by his son Francis, one of his sons Francis. And much of it, rather than sort of talking about his personal life and his qualities, it was very much, you know, where do his inventions sit? Where do we start to think about where he was kind of lost to this idea of oblivion? Oblivion was a word that was used a lot, or forgotten. And it was this idea that we need to remember him, we need to resituate him in the kind of narrative of railways. And you start to see that again as sort of pushing through the different commemorative things that they have for him. So it's not even necessarily what was there, but the way that it was talked about. So, for example, you know, this statue here that's in Campbell, and the sort of narrative around it is, you know, we're remembering one of, you know, Cornwall's sons and trying to resituate him and remember him and all this kind of stuff. Whereas Stephenson and the statue that they have there, it's very much, you know, how do we situate him in a storyline of Newcastle and how the railways have impacted that. So he's already quite established in terms of what he can do. Would you mind just going to the next slide, please, David?
Okay.
Thank you. I think one of the most interesting things here, there's two parts. First of all, is that Stephenson had a reasonable amount of international recognition, despite his career not really taking him out of England, whereas Trevithick, who spent a large portion of his career in South America, as far as I've found, there's nothing about him. And so the image, the big bronze, that was actually connects to the Stockton and Darlington celebrations in 1925. This was a bronze made, sort of funded by the Italian railwaymen in honour of George Stephenson. So it was sort of about the Stockton and Darlington Railway, but more so about George Stephenson. you can almost credit Samuel Smiles again for this. His self-help books were very popular, having been translated into several languages, including Italian. And they started to sort of commission people to start writing Italian versions of self-help, like who are the people that we should start emulating. But Stevenson still held quite a decent amount of renown for them to decide to do sort of this kind of level of statue for him. There are two others that are in stations in Italy as well. One that was for the anniversary of the Liverpool and Manchester, I think. No, sorry, one was for the Rainhill trials, I think, and the Liverpool and Manchester, and the other one was for the centenary of his birth. So yeah, it's sort of exporting out that way. But he starts to lose, I'd say in general, particularly in the UK as well, after the sort of early 20th century, Stevenson doesn't really seem to be as important for people to celebrate. They don't really find themselves needing to think about him. You know, he's the old age of steam, and they're pushing forward. So, you know, times of like Gresley, for example, you're starting to move on to these new technologies, these new figures that you want to celebrate. Whereas Trevithick, and I'm very happy for him in these respects, in 1983, they started the first Campbell and Trevithick Day, which was basically to celebrate Trevithick, and I forget what date it coincides with. I think it might be his birth, I think, in terms of the month it's in. And each year they hold celebrations that includes like road engines and dancing and like very Cornish things. So it's like a combination of Trevithick and Cornwall all wrapped up into one. And that still happens today. It's been happening every year since 1983. And since I think it's 2012, they had one in Tavern as well, which is where this mosaic is here that they've designed for Trevithick. And they've now started to do that annually as well. So I think that Trevithick's staying power as somebody that is worth remembering now is very much regional, and I think that's to his credit, you know, that people want to remember him in combination with their local area, something that he's done for that, rather than this big national figure that I think just gets so overshadowed by other national figures, be they in railways or otherwise, that you kind of get pushed out of the boat in terms of whether people want to remember you.
Yeah. On that, to follow on, we've got a question from Erin. Hi, Erin. Erin will be coming on in a few weeks. And she asked, did you find a contrast between Richard and George's representation in terms of the profession? Are they commemorated as mechanical or civil engineers in your sources? Do you know?
Now, I'm trying to remember which way round it is, but is it the Institute of Civil Engineers that take up Trevithick? Because this is terrible. This is why I need to reread my piece again. But in 1933, they had a series of commemorative stuff for his the centenary of his death, or around then. They basically haven't quite got the dates right, but they put a sort of plaque up outside the institute that was for Trevithick. So he is very much described in that way. And I think, and then on the flip of that, Stevenson is very much the kind of mechanical engineers. I think it's that way round. I forget which one that was kind of the branch off of that, which branched off which. Right. But yeah, I hadn't really talked about that very much. But yes, they kind of split in terms of who talks about who, I guess, in terms of that. But I wouldn't say that it's in terms of how it's discussed in commemorative stuff. I don't think they talk so much about which institute it is connected to. It's more, I guess it's more about what it is that they think that the contributions add. And I think not necessarily the problem, but the problem when you talk about Stevenson is that his reputation as a person always comes out more, I'd say, than it does about the technologies. Like the technologies are a sort of part and parcel of what he does, whereas Trevithick, it's very much, you know, what is it that he has added. So the statue that was in Campbell and that they've got outside the library, the plinth has little bronzes of different parts of his career. So there's bits that's about like, you know, dredging, and there's a bit where, you know, the back panel is about him going over to South America to deal with the mining engineering and that kind of stuff. So I suppose that's kind of the big difference in terms about how they're talked about in terms of inventions. But I wouldn't say that each of the institutes necessarily publicly claim them as much as I probably would have expected them to, I guess, if that's who they're kind of lauding. Yeah.
I wondered, where's Robert in all this? Did you come across a different narrative for him?
I didn't do too much on Robert, but what you find is that, you know, you kind of talk about one, you might talk about the other one as well. You know, the Stevensons together. And for example, there's a stained glass window in Westminster Abbey that is actually dedicated to Robert. But George is included in that narrative. And again, as we were saying, David, about that kind of where do you fit in the narrative of the history of transport, this stained glass goes back to basically Noah building an ark. And then how do we go through all the different types of engineers? I think the Telford's there. I forget who else is mentioned in the stained glass as well. So it's almost like if Robert's there, then Stevenson, then George might get mentioned as well. And then also the biographies by Smiles. It goes on to sort of do both of them. So you talk about part and parcel together but I think George is always that kind of, he was the first one and his son is kind of pushing on from that. But yeah, I think this is the problem with having way too much commemoration to do and having to pick pick Stevenson. So like, but yeah, I think there's probably a lot more to say about Robert in these respects as well. But I think that it is interesting that, you know, they're never, not that they should, but they're not seen in competition. I think it's this kind of, you know, it's a togetherness that comes into what they've invented and what they do for that kind of period of history of the railways.
David asks, can any parallels be drawn with various royal jubilees, Victorian Golden Jubilee and George V Silver Jubilee? And do you think?
I haven't looked too much into the comparisons with those, but I think that of course there is a level that can be compared. But what I would say, and I talk about this a lot, is that whilst it's not unique that the railways are celebrated in these kind of grand ways, is that the railways themselves are unique in how you can tell the stories of what they do, which is why I think it's so interesting and great that obviously that they use the actual technologies as a big part of how they tell the stories of what they do. And you can't really do that if you're talking about the royals, for example. You know.
Yes, so we're back. So, everybody, what I'm going to say is I've found a way to make these breaks very short. I know I know what that is, but so just bear with us if it happens again. So apologies for this. But shall we move on to? Where were you on that question? Did you?
Oh, I think I basically answered it, but I think it was just more the point that, I think that it being a transportation industry makes these quite unique, I think was what I was basically trying to say. So,
okay. Should we move on to the next one? See what's...
Okay. So this was where I was looking at the sort of internal commemorations of the unions and the Great Western railway companies. And what I found quite interesting in terms of whether people had done any work on this is there was next to nothing. You know, it's these ideas of like, you know, when you'd retire or when you'd change position in the company. A lot of work has been done in terms of, it's like, you know, kind of anthropological things, you know, distant history, more kind of archaeological periods of history, in terms of how gifts are given or how people celebrate each other. And I thought, you know, this is a really good area to think about this, because if any of you have read Hannah Reeves' work on railway families, it's this idea of a very large community, but it's also insular within of itself, but it spans the whole of the country. And this is what I found, is that actually you having to find ways of understanding how people engage with each other in these workplace settings, from very little evidence really. And so the sort of magazines and newspapers of the the NUR slash the ASRS and the Great Western Railway were really helpful to find and understand how they kind of worked together with each other and how they celebrated each other here. For example, I think all of these objects are in the National Railway Museum collection, and you can obviously understand how they work. You can see that it says on there, this was given for this reason, for a retirement or during a strike or something like that. But there's more context that can be given in terms of why this is done and how they talk about it. So, for example, one of the big things that I found in terms of discrepancies here is how they talk about their union members or how they talk about their staff members. So in terms of staff members, it was very much, you might say, George has been working for the company for this many years. And then what you'd do is you'd say, over this many years, these are all the great things that have happened in terms of the railways and how we've expanded and how we've done this. So it's not, it is about the person, but it's also talking more broadly about what the companies have to offer, for example. And this was both in terms of ceremonies they might do or little bits that might be obituaries or pieces on them changing position. So it was never just done as a very simple, here's a gift, you're retiring, you're moving. Whereas with the union gifting, so the badges that they had here, for example, or the stick for leaving the branches, it was very much talked about in terms of how these people might have exemplified union qualities, sort of brotherhood stuff, and how they brought in so many more members and what they did for the cause. So whilst they're still giving gifts, these gifts by themselves don't tell you how they necessarily felt about these people or how they felt about the organisations that they were associated with. So yeah, it was a really great way to kind of delve into what the sort of broader meaning is behind these types of objects more than anything. And then would you mind just going to the next slide as well, David? If any of you have been into the National Railway Museum, you may have seen this absolutely excellent archive. And if you haven't, I highly recommend you just go and look at it. Like, this is just a sample of some of the crazy stuff that's in there. So this is a scrapbook called Enginorum, which was sort of compiled of stuff by the Great Western Railway Drawings Office down in Paddington. It isn't full of commemorative stuff. There are some where they sort of do cartoons of where they've gone on a night out and someone's ended up drunk in a graveyard. It's very strange. There's a fox in there or something as well, and I'm not quite sure why, other than maybe they just decided they'd make it. But they also have little things in there that are about commemorative stuff, and I found this really helpful because when you're looking at company magazines, you can only see what the company, or even of course the union, wants to portray about the commemorative stuff that they do and why they're doing it. Whereas Enginorum was just for this very small community of men working together in this office, and it was a really great way to see how they celebrated each other. So the one in the middle, they had a dinner to celebrate one of their workers going off to the Boer War, and there was another point where one of them comes back as well. And this is, quite a genuine, very nice gesture. And one of them, the gentleman that leaves here, ends up passing away during the war. And they also include a letter that comes back to his father saying about what happened. So there are genuine moments where, they're clearly thinking about their staff in a very kind of solemn way, or a celebratory way, as it were. And then this one up in the corner, which is the testimonial, there were things that were clearly just mocking what they did in the magazines. For example, they used to do, as I said, these kind of short biographies about people when they might change position, and someone had one written about them in I forget which magazine it was, and so they each decided to write their own little biographies of each other, which were just mocking each other the entire time. And this is the top of a testimonial which they'd give as a gift for people leaving, that they've clearly just done their own drawing of. I think it's an absolutely amazing drawing that they've done, but it's just completely taking the mick out of what they do in these official capacities as well. So it's a really interesting source. I mean, as I said, it's not just about commemorative stuff, but for me, I was really happy to find that they had these moments where it's like, this is what you do and this is how you engage with each other.
It's I've seen it as well. It's a fascinating book. It's just like gets beyond the sort of very stale histories of well, stale, but perhaps not the word, but the straightforward histories of railway workers to get actually sort of the community life of this of the drawing office. So
yeah, it was great. It was, and it's rare. Like, this is so rare to find, to something like this. And obviously, you know, I can't necessarily extrapolate this to any other, you know, sort of offices or companies or anything, but it clearly shows that there's a way that you can look at this, that, you know, these things do still happen in these small communities, even without the kind of spiel that comes out in the company magazines about how they might have celebrated Charles Bell leaving, for example. So yeah.
Cool. Should we head on to the next one?
Yeah. So this is the shift over to 20th and 21st century stuff. And what I think.
Wait a minute. Excellent connection. Go. Yes.
Yeah, working with the Railway Museum, sort of seeing the ways that they both kind of support commemorative stuff and they stage commemorative stuff. So as I said, like, the National Railway Museum itself is born out of its collections, and its site now are born out of commemoration. You know, sort of getting collections from the Northeastern Railway Museum that they had in York, which they then sort of brought together with stuff from 1925, for example, and then of course 1975 with the Stockton and Darlington, the museum was officially opened on the 150th anniversary as well. And obviously locomotion has its strong history connected to the Stockton and Darlington Railway as well. So it's really pulling back to this history of the industry. But then you have points where, as I said, it's sort of a space to stage commemorative practices. So, for example, you can see in the top that was Mallard 75, and that's I forget whether that's the Great Gathering or the Great Goodbye. It's one of them. I can't quite see what I've captioned it, but that would be the Gathering. This is where I probably got it wrong, and I hope I haven't. But but it was an opportunity to be able to celebrate the history of this kind of, you know, record breaking steam and the logistics of having to bring all these things together. You know, it's crazy, you know, having to bring them from overseas to do this, just to get, for example, this kind of photo opportunity. But they're there as a space to kind of foster the history of the railways, and this can be done in targeted ways when it comes to commemoration. And then in the bottom corner with the Virgin trains, this again is sort of a combination of sort of working with industry partners and celebrating the National Railway Museum, where they renamed the HST that they'd already named in 1985 after the Railway Museum. So they renamed it again for the 40th anniversary there. And I found that these days they really like to add cake to.
That's not a bad thing at all, I don't think.
Well, I went to the Azuma launch, the one that was in August, and there was a cake, but I don't remember anybody eating it. So I'm just like, I just wonder who it's for.
I have to confess, I think I had a bit of cake.
Well, I didn't have any cake. Why didn't you bring me some cake?
I thought everybody was getting cake.
I think I was too busy, you know, taking photographs for my thesis, so I'm going to blame that for not having cake.
Fair enough.
But yeah, it's kind of and this is, I think this says quite a lot about, in terms of, you know, sort of industry partners working together, because, you know, particularly of sort of recent time, we'll talk about shortly, is the kind of work that you see between the National Railway Museum and VTech, and obviously now LNER. And so this is kind of reciprocated in terms of sort of dedications and stuff like that, and celebrating museum. And then of course the last thing was thinking about Flying Scotsman, and this I think was really interesting in terms of this kind of buying the engine for the nation. And this says a lot obviously about the National Railway Museum itself, is that, you know, it is meant to be the house of the nation's collections and what we have, and caring for it. But also obviously stemming out of that, there were so many events and stuff like that which were sort of buying for the people, and it's good breaks.
Right, we should be back, yes.
wonderful. But yeah, I think it's easy to forget how much these institutions that care and display these collections actually do for celebrating the railways, kind of bringing out these things. But I think it's also one of those where it's like you can't celebrate everything. So what do you choose? And I suppose these are, you know, some of the, particularly with things like the Mallard 75, that was quite a big anniversary to do. And, you know, they've had Railfest and stuff like that. The one in 2004, which I think celebrated 4 different anniversaries, and I'm not going to remember all of them. I think it was the very first, like, wooden railway. There was it Penny Darren? And then there was something in 1904, which I've totally forgotten what that one is as well.
City of Truro, high speed.
It probably was City of Truro. And you just think there's just so many anniversaries just kind of rolled into one big conglomerate. I think people did stuff in an 04 just so that they'd be to bring them all together. Right. But it's just a really great kind of it's a great space to kind of work with this stuff, and I suppose it's kind of difficult to think then, you know, do people feel that there's an obligation for these museums to then have to be the people to do these celebrations? And then that becomes quite difficult because they are costly to hold these things, and, you know, it has to be about revenue as much as it is anything else with institutions like this. So yeah, it's, you know, what do you pick, what do you choose, what do you think will bring in the biggest crowds? So
right, shall we?
Yeah, because then that's a good kind of segue into this.
Who?
So yeah, I was looking at. I won't talk too much about the kind of branding of this. I think you said, David, that someone's already spoken.
No, we didn't get onto this because we thought you might be talking about it a bit. So
I won't go on too much about it. But what I think, as everyone I think will know, obviously there's been the shift over to these 2 pre-nationalisation names. And I think the most interesting part about this is the way that they have taken on or have not taken on the kind of old identities of these 2 companies. For Great Western Railway, this is very much situated in their long history. I'd like, you know, they use phrases like the Renaissance of rail and since Brunel and Brunel's custodians of Brunel's railway and that kind of stuff. So it's very much about, you know, where do they sit in the history of this? And then also in terms of the branding, you know, you see the very kind of beautiful Art Deco style, you know, sort of early 20th century stuff that they have with that. And it's very much based on kind of a Western community, I guess. And this is one of the things that came out quite heavily in the commemorative stuff. I can't remember. Did I do the which video was the Great Western Railway one? Or is it the next or the one after that? I probably got them the wrong way around.
Do you want me to move over? Is it?
Yeah, I just can't remember which one it is.
That one.
Good, I did do it the right way around. So one of the things that they did is very much like the 100 Great Britons poll that they did however many years ago. They did the 100 Great Westerners and got people of the local sort of Western region to do a poll of the sort of 100 greatest Westerners that they know. And what they then did with this poll is they picked the top 50, and they're now using them to as names on their new Class 800s. So this here is Fleur Lombard. She was a firefighter who died in a fire in 1996. And what they do is, as you can see there, they've got the name, they've got something quite personalised there, and there are 2 coins that they have as well. So one of them is very specific to the new kind of Great Western and their kind of style. It's very symbolic. And the other one that they have is of things that represent that person more specifically. And again, this is as you can see, they're filming them as well. They have a ceremony with them too, which usually involves members of their community and their families who come along to these dedication ceremonies. And it's a very interesting way of kind of connecting this railway and how they identify themselves now as a kind of community. A community company, I guess, as you say, a community franchise, and what they do for the local area. Because obviously under First Great Western, there was always so many complaints about everything that they did, you know, timing, cleanliness, everything. And it was a real opportunity to kind of resituate themselves and make themselves relevant again. And these ceremonies like this are really important, I think, to kind of connect them to these communities again. So commemoration is not just about these big celebratory things, but again, it's this kind of targeted way of doing it. So within sort of looking to the past, they're sort of involving people now in what they do. So I say the difference here is kind of stylized in the way that they talk about people. And if you go on to the next one, please, David.
Okay. Cool.
So this one is, of course, VTech, but quite similar to the Azuma launches of what they've been doing as well in terms of adding the new and old. Now, one of the best things that I heard about this is they said for the first time ever, this is running 4 trains down the East Coast main line, and I think they said side by side, and they said the first time. I was like, well, if we talk about the semantics of it, yes, I guess it is the first time. But as I talked about with the Stockton and Darlington celebrations previously, you use this long history of railways and sort of run them down the East Coast main line to look at how they run and how they're different. So while they think they're pulling on something that's particularly different, yes, slightly, but yeah, it's this idea of looking at old technology versus new technology and how this shows progress. So of course they include the Flying Scotsman here, which again, the sort of role species and stuff that they're doing. But again, it's this, so the way that the LNER have been promoting themselves is very much about this innovation and connecting quite a lot, of course, to a combination of being a Northeastern brand, as it were, and also what they have in connection to Japanese railways and the history of that, as well as the current stuff. So the word Azuma means east, and I think it might mean something else as well, but it's sort of using the idea of saying that they're connecting it back to the east in terms of the east of England and the east in terms of the east of the world. And so, yeah, it's this kind of great combination of what they're doing to talk about progress. So actually, I'd say that they're following on in the lines in terms of what the Eastern Railways have been doing since, just in a slightly different way. And it does, it kind of, again, it's pushing, using commemorative events to push what they are trying to brand themselves as, which is this kind of innovation and kind of change and new technologies. So same, obviously the same power cars that they're using here, but very different ways of advertising them through commemoration.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, we've got a couple of questions, because this is something that, of course, people quite to think about a lot. I mean, Mike Espester, you might have heard of him. I say that every time. Hello, Mike. How you doing? He says Southwestern Railway having a crack at renaming too.
Is that a question or
I don't know. He put a question. Well, I mean, I did my thesis on the Southwestern, so they're not living up to it. So anyway,
isn't it? How do you really make people care again? You know. Change it. What are you doing that's supposed to be so new and interesting? I mean, obviously the circumstances, at least for LNER and GWR, very. LNER was, we're getting rid of Virgin running this franchise now, so how do we think about a nationalised railway again, and how do we rename that? And GWR is very much, people don't like what we're selling, so how do we get them to find confidence again? So clearly what they'll have been doing, whatever they were trying to achieve, hasn't quite worked. But yeah, I think it's a tricky one to maybe gain confidence in, but I think that very iconic Great Western image has served them really well. And then in terms of LNER and what they're doing, they've been pushing the Azuma for so long and this great new technology, that actually pushing it as a kind of forward-facing, innovative thing is a great way to do it. But I don't necessarily know what Southern Rail has that is unique, I guess. What is their selling point, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think when you look at it, it's LNER and GWR have got that historical cachet that London South Western Railway has never had. I mean, that is why I studied it, because it was a company that was sort of not really very famous and therefore more interesting in some ways. So they really draw on that cachet. I mean, Phil has actually raised a good point about LNER. So GNER harked back to a golden era and called itself the route of the Flying Scotsman, but couldn't quite call itself LNER at the time of privatisation. So there's an interesting sort of thing about the route itself being something that the different operators at points have bought into the history.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, yeah, it is. It's where, what you're going to identify. I mean, I think that was kind of the big thing. As soon as nationalisation happened, and particularly that was with the Great Western Railway, with the workers and stuff, and reading through the magazines, there's this huge kind of like loss of identity that happens. So then what happens when you privatise again and you start trying to pick up these identities again? Does it situate itself well? Does it work? Do people get it? And I think, I don't know what's so particularly so special about now, why people are necessarily more aware of what these companies were or what they are, I guess, but they sit very well. I think we're in an era where people clearly like the early 20th century again, I think.
Well, I think maybe part of it is that nowadays we have much more of a, compared to when I say starting my thesis and 10 years before, a much more broader, the history of railways seems much more present now. Maybe things like Michael Portillo's show has brought railway history further into the public domain, and people seem to be more interested in it, or more so than they have been for quite a while. So maybe that's an element. So I'm just looking through some questions here. So Mike suggests the point about distinctive identity is important. Southwest and Ellatoir are not so distinctive, but possibly also a product of pre- and post-grouping companies.
Right.
Maybe.
And the thing, and this is the point, is that actually what I'm doing here, what I've done so far in this thesis, I'm hoping it at least gets people to think about, as Mike has done here, why didn't it work for Southern Rail? This is just hopefully a springboard for people to consider why things may or may not have worked. And maybe it's not to do with commemoration, maybe it is more specifically to do, because this is obviously branding, but I wanted to focus on what commemoration did for this. But yeah, how do you start then to think about how this expands further to companies that aren't pick up these old names, for example? Yeah.
Well, what's something that was interesting I found out when sort of LNER was on the started to come through, is that I looked on the copyright, and I think I said this when Nicola Forsyth was on, but what happened is that LNER was actually registered before the Christmas after which Virgin East Coast went, but also registered was London Midland and Scottish and Great Eastern Railway.
Yes.
So clearly someone at the DFT has got a nostalgic dimension to their thinking. Maybe the minister even at that point, which was Grayling. So it's they haven't emerged. So we'll see what happens there. But it is interesting to think which ones they didn't like register London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway. It's a bit of a mouthful, probably. So.
But it is. I think I didn't realise that, but that's very forward thinking on it, to be honest. If you think that maybe there'll be the opportunity to, or I say the opportunity, it's not really a great opportunity if something, needs to be rescued by the government, but, you're thinking ahead in terms, and as you said, I think it is very much this whole nostalgic view of this is, I enjoy this and it will work. And it is very dependent sometimes, as you said, on maybe one minister that enjoys railway history particularly, and that's enough to sort of swing back to these old names.
Although what is interesting, because we got Southwest Railway, whatever they call themselves, but we've had for a very long time Southern on the which nobody blinked an eyelid. Nobody still does. That it's actually a very one of the big four. So
yes,
it's fascinating. So. Should we?
But no,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, Karen.
No, go. Let's shift.
I'm just conscious of the time a bit, so.
No, I won't spend too long on this one, more because I say there's not much to say, but actually this is all kind of partially speculative work, but something that's really interesting to look at, and it kind of brings me full circle back to what I started with, I guess. So I started looking into the planning for the Stockton and Darlington bicentenary in 2025. And my reason for doing this was that there's a lot where you can see what has happened and what decisions were made retrospectively, but you don't necessarily see what is happening in the process of thinking about why you do commemoration. And So this involved interviews with members of the Railway Heritage Board who are part of organising the different elements of 2025, and sort of gauging what it is that they want out of these celebrations, but also things as minute, but there are some really big questions here about, what do you call these celebrations? How do people identify with them? So one of the things that was peddled quite heavily, particularly in 1875 and 1925, is this idea of the first railway in the world. And I think it's kind of a combination of people's sort of broadening knowledge about the sort of railway history, as it were, and also this idea that you want to be as accurate as possible. That's very much a bigger thing now, is to sort of think about, well, if it's not the first railway in the world, why is it so special? Why would you spend this much money celebrating an anniversary if it's not of something that's of great interest to people? So at the moment they seem to still be juggling over what you'd call it. But so another big thing that came out of this is there's a really big shift in terms of commemoration. Again, like, why are you commemorating? For this, a lot of it is to do with, as far as I could gauge from it, is sort of regeneration of the area. So it's not just about protecting the history, but it's what does the history and heritage do for the local people in and around the 26 miles of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And so the diagram that they have here now, they've officially appointed an architect company, I think Space Architects, to design what's called the Railway Heritage Quarter. So this will be centred around Head of Steam in Darlington. And this will include things, like spaces for workshops and play areas, and museum space to talk about the history of the Stockton and Darlington and more generally kind of railway history of the area. But it's not, as I said, and what they're hoping to do is to sort of open up the 26 miles of the original line to a kind of walking and cycling route to help with well-being and commutes to work, so environmental. So there's so much that now was not the remit of the earlier celebrations, and I think that's largely due to the fact that this is not run by a railway company. This is run by the Tees Valley Combined Authority is the kind of central figure there, and English Heritage have had a reasonable stake in this because they've put money in to help with kind of surveys and stuff like that. And so I think what's most interesting is that, again, as I said, it's this idea of what does commemoration have to do now, and what do we say about it? How do we justify what we're doing, and what does it do for people now, as much as kind of helping to protect and spread knowledge about railway history. This was a really interesting piece of the thesis to do, and I'm hoping to kind of continue on with this to sort of look at the planning, look at what happened, and then think about the aftermath. Everything that they hope will continue to happen, will the outcomes actually happen? And I think that's one of the big things that we need to gauge. But obviously, time will tell with that.
I suppose from your perspective, you've got an interesting perspective. If, say, like what were you, 2020, in 10 years' time, you look back, you can perhaps fit this in a different way into the narrative of your thesis, or the sort of an addendum and an extra bit on the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was kind of the plan as soon as I started thinking about this. Originally, it was only going to be quite a short part of the thesis, and I thought there's actually way more to say here, but I already know that I can't say everything that needs to be said. But you're right, yeah, it very much needs to be that kind of, then we need to look back and then see what happened and what I thought and whether it was going to happen. I mean, the first half of this thesis as well was really helpful for thinking about what kind of questions I did want to ask. Because, you come at it, the historical things, and you think, right, I've looked through planning documents, I've looked through minutes, I've looked through this, but actually what were the things that I didn't get into? What are the things I'd love to have asked those organisers when they were going through this process? Because there's a lot that's missed out of those conversations that are noted down in a minute book. It's not quite the same thing.
I remember the frustration of a minute book that doesn't tell you what you want.
I think you had to go photograph some for me, actually, David, when I forgot to photograph one of them.
So I did, yes.
I'm not sure what it told me either. I hope it was something useful, since you spent the time.
1975 or 1925? I can't remember. Never mind.
75 was about 100 different folders worth of stuff. I've never gone through so many folders in my life. Yeah. Some of them were very short, though. The one that was on history, I think, was 2 pages long. That was on finance was like 3 binders, so
Yeah, they certainly certainly downplayed the history, didn't they? Was
Sorry.
that all? And
You could even,
sorry.
yeah. No, I was going to say you could just have gauged how much they cared about the history by the width of the folder. That was enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that frequently with British Rail files, sometimes they're fulsome, sometimes it's just like, what's this piece of paper? So
I think they even
sorry.
should probably pack out or do some more work on the history. Do you think we should do some more? And then they clearly didn't. So never mind.
Never mind. And we've got this time capsule.
Oh yeah, sorry, I hadn't actually mentioned that. So I went to the the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway holds an annual sort of birthday party celebration, as it were, for the Stockton and Darlington. So I went the September just gone, and they revealed one of the descendants, I think that's the right way around, of Wayneman Dixon, has a time capsule that was packed up in 1925, which basically says not to be opened until 2025, which is kind of strange. You spend so much time kind of studying these things, and then you come along and, I'm actually really excited. I would like to be there. I hope they invite me to when they open this parcel. I think they've kind of given an indication of what's in there, but I think it will be really interesting. And they are looking ahead. They already believe that 2025 is going to be something that should be celebrated, and I'm glad just for the Wayman who packed this up that it is, because otherwise I think it would have been less ceremonious than I think it will be now. I think it went on to the Antiques Roadshow as well, but they had to scan it in case there was something that was dangerous inside, because they said obviously the parcel. But yeah, so I think that's going to be really great. But again, so yeah, these annual events that the Friends do, I think is a really great way to kind of drum up interest as much as anything about these about 2025. And they did spend a portion of the time saying what was going to be happening and what progress they'd made. And there are a lot of groups that have a stake to hold in this, in making sure that 2025 means something. Not just in terms of kind of bringing in revenue, but it's going to, if you can start building up the area and in the past the Northeast has been very disenfranchised with various losses of industry, to bring something positive back would be really great for everybody involved, I think. And as kind of these heritage groups and interest groups, as much as it is kind of the local area as well. So I'm really excited for them, and I hope it goes really well.
Yeah. Graham says that he's sure that they will invite you to the opening of the package.
Thank you.
I'm sure they must do. They must do.
It's just like I'll just have to say, well, if you don't invite me, it won't go in the write-up that I do, or I'll just be bitter. I'll put a footnote in. Was not invited to the opening, but it happened.
Mike wonders whether there'll be a 2025 package to be opened in 21-25.
I can't remember whether I asked them that, but I feel like they should probably do it. But they'll have to make it like a paper format, because I was thinking like, do you make like a tape of something? But then like all technologies will be obsolete in like 100 years. So paper. They've
already read the pages because they can scan through it. It's just not, yeah.
But it would be great if they did that, and I think it would just be, as I said, like this has been really great because obviously it is happy. They are going to be opening it, and it is going to be really exciting. But it would be terrible if it got to 30-25 and no one really cares anymore.
Well, we'll see. We might all be beaming in somewhere.
Yeah, so that'd be nice.
So yes, that's the presentation. So any final comments, Sophie, or we've rattled through a lot.
I was going to say there's been a lot here, but I think it was just more important for me to just kind of show the scope of what there is to work with. As I said, I've only touched the surface on what can be done here.
Yeah.
And I know that there are other sort of research projects that touch on commemoration, and I think that's more the point, thinking about it as a way that people engage with history. And I think we all do now, everybody that's clearly on this channel, this is a way that you engage with this. This is the way you think about railway history, and you enjoy talking about it and listening about it. And I think it's just being a bit more critical sometimes about what you hear. As I said, it's not necessarily an interest to me exactly what the history is, but what people think the history is. And it's all that kind of fake news stuff, isn't it? Just keeping your ear to the ground. And then it makes you think a little bit more about commemoration more broadly. As you said, David, there's a lot of contestation over things now. And for me to be able to talk about, the statues that are down in Bristol, I can think about that, and hopefully you can think a bit more about who made these statues, who are they actually for. They're not for everybody, they're for certain people that wanted that statue to be there. And so commemoration, I think it's a personal kind of child of mine that I really enjoy and just to think about. And hopefully at some point there will be at some point some articles out, hopefully, and eventually one day maybe a book that you can read, but that will be a little while away. But yeah, hopefully
all articles, yeah.
If anything comes out.
I'm sorry, I just think your thesis is great, so yeah.
I'm so glad. But yeah, no, thank you so much, David. It's been really, really great to chat.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And yes, I think I should apologise for all the glitches I've worked out. It's probably my computer, so hopefully I'll get that fixed soon. But hopefully, the gaps weren't too long once I figured it out. So I can edit some of these things out in the after show.
I was going to say, because I feel like there were a lot of faces that probably got sort of freeze framed.
Yeah, I'm gonna edit. So I'm actually taking a week off, everybody. So I'm taking a week off. Sorry, I'm going on holiday. But next time we have Lewis Smith, who's coming on to talk about BOAC, building a BOC Britain, selling civil aviation, and that's in 2 weeks' time. And all I can really say is thank you again, Sophie, for coming on, and it's been really fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you everybody else for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. So goodbye, everybody. Right, we're out.